Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. There's my team lighting up their cameras. So thank you for joining us this evening for a workshop on the development of the EV infrastructure plan for Delaware. Next slide, Joe. This is the second of the same meeting. So we held this same meeting, the same presentation, content and material, the format exactly the same on October 24th. We did have some issues with the Zoom link, and so some folks weren't able to join us who had hoped to. And so we wanted to be able to provide another opportunity for them and others to be able to see the same content. We do have the recording from October 24th on the web page, and we will also be providing this recording from the 5 o'clock session and the 6 o'clock session on the web page as well. Okay, so we'll do some introductions of the team. My name is Stephanie Johnson. I am the Assistant Director at DelDOT in the Division of Transportation Resiliency and Sustainability. Jim Pappas, who was unable to be with us today, is the Director of that same division. And then we are joined as a team with DNREC and AECOM. DNREC being in this space for a lot longer than DelDOT, and having a lot of the expertise, and then AECOM providing a significant amount of support. So I will hand it over to Susan and then to Joe.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for attending tonight. My name is Susan Love. I'm the administrator of the Climate and Sustainability section in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control. More importantly, Brianne Prison is here. Brianne, can you introduce yourself?
Yep. My name is Brianne Prison. I am the Clean Transportation Program Manager for the Division of Climate, Coastal and Energy Sustainability, Climate and Sustainability section. Thanks for coming tonight.
And we'll hand it back over to AECOM.
Thanks, Susan. Hi, my name is Joe Hoffsey. I'm with AECOM, and we're happy to support DelDOT and DNREC on the development of the EV infrastructure plan. I'm joined by Brendan Connolly out of our Energy Group, who's been doing the analysis of the existing and future conditions.
Okay. So this evening we'll be going over several things, a lot of great information. At the top of the meeting, we'll talk about what you can expect from this workshop. We'll go over the background for the EV infrastructure plan. So why is it important, and what is an EV infrastructure plan exactly? We'll talk about the draft plan's vision and goal areas. We'll also discuss the existing infrastructure conditions. So what do we currently have out there? And then what are we envisioning adding, and what locations, and how is that, how are those decisions going to be made? So an overview of some analysis. And then we will wrap it up with the next steps, what happens after this public workshop, how you can continue to stay involved. And then through the Q&A function on the Zoom session tonight, you can ask questions and we will do our best to provide those answers. So with that, I will hand it over to Joe.
Thanks, Stephanie. So now I'm going to go into the meeting expectations. So as Stephanie mentioned, this is the first public meeting. It's a repeat of the one we had earlier in October, but there's going to be more meetings to follow. So this is just our first one that we're having, and we're going to be getting into more information in the future meetings. So why are we here tonight? We're here to kick off the planning process with you, the members of the public, and begin the public engagement with you and start the conversations with you, the public. So tonight, if you want to provide comments or ask questions during the presentation, you can use the Zoom's Q&A function anytime during the presentation and during the question and answer period to offer comments or ask questions. The questions are only going to be seen by the presenters ourselves, but at the end of the presentation, we'll go through those Q&A questions. Anytime after tonight, you can fill out a comment form in the project's virtual room that can be accessed via the plan's website, https://DelDOT.gov/programs/NEVI/. Or anytime you can send an email to this group via the email evplan@delaware.gov. I also like to take this time to thank our EV Infrastructure Plan Advisory Group. This is the list of the groups of people that have been working with us to help us develop the plan. We really appreciate the input and we look forward to continuing to work with them in the future. I'm now going to turn it over to Bree to go into why is an EV infrastructure plan important.
All right, thanks, Joe. So yeah, we're going to talk about what kind of went into this, why we're here, why we got to this point, and just going to give some basics on electric vehicles. I don't want to assume everyone on the call is fully in the know of the technology there. So next slide. So Delaware's Climate Action Plan was released in November of 2021. So it's been about a year now that it's been out to the public, and it is intended to guide the state's efforts in minimizing greenhouse gas emissions and maximizing our resiliency to climate change impacts. So the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions is from the transportation sector, particularly from light duty passenger vehicles. And so over the last several decades, we've learned for multiple reasons, we've learned to rely on our cars to kind of get us from point A to point B. And emissions coming from those tailpipes of our cars contain a suite of pollutants that are not only the largest contributors to the effects of climate change, but also have had a pretty profound negative impact on our air quality and human health, particularly in those disproportionately impacted communities that are near like our pollution sources, such as highways, ports, and the power plants. So, areas with more traffic will see greater effects with higher number of affected people. So there tend to be higher hospitalization rates in our younger and older populations, and children will miss more school from illnesses such as asthma. And so because of this, they tend to fall behind academically. So that there's been a correlation in some areas with lower graduation rates because of that. So in the state's climate action plan, one strategy to minimize our greenhouse gas emissions is to transition to zero emission vehicles and more efficient transportation systems. And so in order to transition into zero emission vehicles, such as electric vehicles, because that's kind of what our focus on the technology is today, is there needs to be infrastructure in place to help with that transition. Next slide, please. So the availability of charging stations is a pretty critical factor in our electric vehicle adoption. So having a comprehensive charging network, including home and public charging, ensures that electric vehicles are as convenient as conventional vehicles, and that increases driver confidence in wanting to take that leap into getting into an electric vehicle. So to kind of help guide that transition, we really needed to get an understanding of the landscape and where EV charging should be placed, or where there should be a focus, or where there isn't enough charging, and we need to focus on some of those areas. So the EV charging infrastructure plan is going to inform us on how to expand that charging network and to strengthen consumer adoption of EVs, but it's also going to help us ensure grid stability. It's going to help us stimulate the economy with job creation and workforce development and training. And the plan is actually intended to be a living document. So it's going to be updated as the landscape changes, which is pretty often right now. It's as you probably all know, it's in the news. It's changing all the time, and so this document will change with that. So next slide, please. Another strategy in the climate action plan is to have 17,000 new EVs sold each year by 2030. And so this is the number that has come out of the modeling that was done for the Delaware Climate Action Plan to achieve our emission reduction goals. And so one of the ways to achieve that is by adopting the Advanced Clean Cars 2 vehicle emission standards, which will require 100% of new vehicle sales to be zero emission vehicles by 2035. And so several manufacturers have already declared that they will be all electric over the next 15 to 20 years, with more manufacturers making that declaration as we get further into that transition. So next slide, please. So again, I don't want to assume that everyone on the call does know the difference with the different technologies. So I'll kind of just quickly go over the basics. So a full battery electric vehicle is simply that. It is all electric. So there's no gasoline needed. There's no engine. There's no thousands of moving parts that can break. So they have low maintenance costs. And then you have and they're super fun to drive. Then you have your hybrid. So you've got your plug-in version, and then you've got your conventional, or your what they call regular hybrid, essentially. So both run on gas and you have a high amount of fuel efficiency, but the plug-in versions have larger batteries, and they do plug into a wall to get a recharge, just like a full electric vehicle does. And that vehicle can run solely on electric first before it needs to kick over to that gas engine to get further down the road. But with a conventional hybrid, the vehicle chooses when the small motor electric motor is used, which is generally when it's idling or driving at very low speeds. So you might be at a stoplight and you hear a vehicle next to you sound like you're restarting the car. That's kind of what that is that small motor there is kind of holding that vehicle steady while it's idling, but then it does need the engine to get going again. So I am going to drop there's going to be a link dropped into the chat that's going to give a pretty comprehensive list of all of the plug-in hybrid and battery electric vehicles available on the market today. They're not going to have the super luxury supercar models that are out there. It's going to be the more affordable ones. But this list does give the prices. It's going to have the current federal tax credits, safety ratings, charging rates at different levels, and anything else you didn't think you needed to know about those vehicles. That list is going to have that for you. And it does change pretty often, especially it's going to be changing more often as more vehicles come out and as the tax credits start changing with the Inflation Reduction Act. Next slide, please. And in terms of how to charge EVs, there are 3 levels. You've got 1, 2, and DC fast charging, or level 3, but it's not too often referred to that as that. It's more DC fast charging. But level 1 is on your typical 110 household outlet. It's a pretty good option for smaller batteries like plug-in hybrids, but for full battery electric vehicles with the larger batteries, it's not always the practical option, as it can take a couple days to charge a fully depleted battery. It can be useful to get some mileage back or to charge overnight if you need that. But for a fully depleted battery, it'll take you a while. So level 2 chargers are on a 208 or 240 volt circuit, depending on its commercial or residential use. But it's just kind of like adding another household appliance, or a dryer or refrigerator, stove, something like that to your home. So this is a more practical option for at-home or work charging. And so during a work day or overnight charging, that can provide drivers with a full tank of fuel, if you will, to go about their business. So there's no more going to be cold mornings standing at the gas station, filling up our gas our cars with gas. So for those who do need charging quick for traveling, or if they forgot to charge at home or work, the DC fast charging are certainly a much quicker option to get the charge that they need to move on. Next slide, please. So what is the state's role in electric vehicle charging? So we do provide funding through various programs, such as grants through either the RFPs or DNREC's Clean Vehicle Rebate Program for vehicles and for charging stations. And our role is to help establish contracting mechanisms and identify areas where policies and regulations may be needed or even changed in order to accelerate or standardize the infrastructure. So there are a few state-owned level 2 charging stations that's installed in some of the state-owned facilities, but the state of Delaware generally does not plan on owning and operating any charging network, particularly with DC fast charging stations. And that the few that are in the state are privately owned and will be privately owned as that network gets built out. So I will go ahead and punt this back over to Joe, who's going to talk about the plan itself and what went into creating it. Thank you.
Thanks, Bree. So what is an EV infrastructure plan? So the main goal of the EV infrastructure plan is to identify the future EV charging needs of Delaware. We want to make sure that we're ahead of the EV implementation of vehicles in the area so that the chargers are out there and readily available for the public when they choose to use them. Special focus of the plan will be paid to the disadvantaged communities, rural areas, and residents of multi-unit dwellings. Typically, it's been found they have the greatest challenges accessing EV charging infrastructure. So we want to make sure that they are not left behind and that they are included as part of the plan in the move towards electric vehicles. We also want to make sure the plan incorporates the following items: assembling data on existing conditions, preparing future forecasts, engaging with you, the stakeholders, and the public, and then making recommendations for EV infrastructure priority areas, which Brendan's going to go into greater detail in a little bit. So as part of the plan, this is outlining a couple of the main sections that are going to be in the plan that we're recommending to be in there. The plan, visions, and goals, which I'm going to be going through in the next couple of slides. The public involvement and stakeholder engagement, which we have kicked off here. And then also the other sections will be existing and future condition analysis, where we're going to focus on the Delaware EV market analysis, and then also the Delaware EV charging demand analysis, which Brendan's going to be going in greater detail later on in the presentation. Then also as part of the plan, we're going to present our findings. And then another key section to the plan is going to be titled Deploying the Infrastructure Building for the Future. In that section, we're going to look at different potential policy barriers that could hinder the implementation of the EV infrastructure. And we want to identify those policies and lay out path forwards. We want to also identify workforce development needs. We want to make sure the existing workforce and those coming into the workforce have the tools and the knowledge to go in and work in the EV infrastructure by installing the EV chargers or maintaining the EV chargers in the future. We're also going to look for future funding sources and new funding sources to help pay for the EV infrastructure. And then another key section is going to be resiliency and sustainability. We want to make sure what's installed as part of this plan and moving forward is resilient and sustainable, that it's there for the future to use and that it's reliable when people go to use it. So our draft plan vision. So our draft plan vision, which we're looking for feedback and suggestions on, the current plan vision we have is enable current and future users of electric vehicles to confidently travel in and across Delaware for work, education, recreation, and exploration. One of the key aspects of this is we want to have the user be confident that they can get from point A to point B and find a reliable charging source so that they can go on to their next point and that their ride will not be interrupted. Part of our draft plan, we established several goals in it, which I'll go through here, but please provide feedback or offer any suggestions to the goals that we're going to be going through here. The first one is equity. We want to ensure that rural, underserved, and disadvantaged communities, including suppliers and contractors, are engaged and realize the plan benefits. As I mentioned before, we want to make sure that they're not left behind. Reliability. We want to develop a reliable, convenient, affordable, and equitable EV infrastructure in Delaware for all users. Connections. We want to connect the Delawareans and travelers in Delaware to EV chargers to support an electric transportation future. Another key goal is education. We want to develop the outreach material on electric vehicles, the good charging habits, station locations, station usage, equipment capabilities, and how to provide feedback on the network. We want to utilize social media and apps to accomplish this. We want to make sure that the public has a great understanding of what EV vehicles are and the EV chargers are, and what the difference between the different EV chargers are and how they can safely access these. And evaluation. We want to develop a framework to collect data and evaluate the plan over time, refine and update as needed. As Bree mentioned previously, we want to make sure that this is a living document that continues to change as the EV world and infrastructure changes with time. I'm now going to be handing over to Brendan to go over the existing conditions.
Thanks, Joe. Hi, everyone. So as Joe mentioned, we'll dive now into the existing condition assessment. So based on data provided from the Alternative Fuel Center, there are a total of 25 DC fast charger locations that host a total of 97 ports. As Bree mentioned earlier, a port is a connector piece to a charging to a vehicle. So there can be numerous ports at a single location, which is why you see those numbers varying. In terms of level 2 charging, there are a total of 108 locations with a total of 229 ports. On the chart on the left, you can see where those charging locations are shown on the map. We'll be providing a close-up of each of the counties on the following slides, but you'll notice some overall trends in charging stations where those are sited. So they're predominantly along the major highway corridors currently and in the northern part of the state. You'll also notice from the map that there's some gap areas where there isn't currently a charging network, and we'll be looking to fill in those gaps as part of this initiative. Next slide, please. So for each of the county maps, we're going to provide a little bit more detail on each charger. We note which chargers are Tesla stations and the capacity levels at the DC fast charging sites. We'll discuss why these details are added in the upcoming slide, but it revolves around the federal guidance and specifications on what type of chargers receive funding. So looking closer at Newcastle County, you can see that there's a current concentration of chargers in Newark and in Wilmington along I-95, with some gaps in the southern part of the county. Slide. In Kent County, you'll notice that charging stations are predominantly along US 13 and Delaware 1, close to Dover, with some of the more rural areas lacking infrastructure. And then finally, Sussex County continues the trend of chargers being sited along some of those more major highway corridors, but there's also numerous chargers sited along the beach towns in the southeast corner of the state. So going back to the rationale for adding some of those additional details on the charging stations in those county maps is the federal government has designations for specific routes that are being prioritized to install EV charging infrastructure on, and these are known as alternative fuel corridors, or AFCs. And you can see that there are 5 routes in the state of Delaware that have been designated as AFCs, and the state is applicable or eligible to apply for more AFC corridors in the future. The current 5 are I-95, I-295, Delaware 1, US 13, and US 113. There's a substantial amount of funding available to install DC fast chargers along these routes through the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, or the NEVI program, which is currently in progress. And that's more focused on these AFC corridors. And parallel to that, this project is really aiming to provide charging infrastructure outside of those corridors and create a network throughout the state. Next slide. We'll move on now to some of our modeling and analysis conducted to assess charging demand and identify priority areas for charging in the future. I note that these are preliminary results at this time, and we're looking for feedback prior to presenting our final results during the next project. To assess charging demand throughout the future, we've developed 4 different growth scenarios: a low, medium, high, and a Clean Car Initiative 2, which is a policy that Delaware is pursuing for EVs in the state. The scenarios investigate the impact different environmental or landscape of EV adoption. So it assesses variances in cost parity of an EV compared to an internal combustion engine, the model availability, charging infrastructure, and policies that really support EV adoption throughout 2040. Based on these findings, you can see that it's projected up to 32% of the passenger vehicle population could be zero emission by 2035. I would say the main takeaway here is to note that the number of EVs on the road is expected to grow significantly in the future and requires an enhanced charging network and policies to support demand, especially to achieve some of these more ambitious targets, such as the Clean Car Initiative, to reach 100% ZEV sales by 2035. Next slide, please. So we'll now talk about, to meet that growing demand, how are we going to site charging infrastructure that supports it, right? So we'll dive into our methodology for identifying priority areas for future charging stations. We'll first go over some of the data layer analysis that we've provided in more detail on the next slide. Next step is going to be to determine the appropriate charger type and the amount of the quantity of chargers at those areas. And then what we're doing here today is really validating that with public and stakeholder engagement to review our methodology and some of our findings. Next slide. So diving into the details about identifying priority areas, we use a tool that's really able to capture a lot of the different priorities of the stakeholders and the public. So we looked at 4 different modules. Each module has criteria associated with it that we pull from publicly available data sources. And each module and criteria can be weighted based on the priority areas of the state. So going through these modules now, the first one being EV charging network, we look at some of the data that was previously provided on existing level 2 and DC fast charging infrastructure. We also pull in data on average annual traffic along some of the routes. The next module, early EV adopters, we look at demographics that have been directly correlated to early EV adoption, income, car ownership, education levels. Land use as being the third module that we look at, and that includes multifamily housing density and population density. And then the final module is equity, where we look at unemployment, social vulnerability, pollution exposure, housing burden, and then the accessibility to public transportation infrastructure. All of these modules are combined together as a result to develop some of our final recommendations that we'll be sharing during the next meeting. So we're hoping to get some feedback on these core 4 modules that we're including here today. Next slide. So we'll dive now into the results of each of those modules using our tool. On the right-hand side, you'll see how we weighted each of those modules and criteria. We distinguished that by using the check mark or the shaded box being what was the weighting selected, right? And so in the map, you can see that the darker green areas reflect higher priority areas to siting charging infrastructure. So for early EV adopters, we wanted to consider where is charging infrastructure going to be needed. Where would it be immediately be utilized in the near term by early EV adopters? Based on our findings, adoption is expected in the northern tip of the state near Dover and along the southern beach towns, which is, unsurprising because that's where a lot of charging infrastructure exists today. And it's historically where EV adoption has occurred in the state. So that was the first module. We'll now dive into the second module of the EV charging network results. And so here we wanted to set a higher priority because the intent of the program is to really focus on filling in gaps in the network and along highly trafficked routes. So you'll see the scores are higher more in those rural areas where charging infrastructure has been missing historically, but then also those main corridors that we distinguish as AFCs, due to their high traffic volume, are ranked a little bit higher priority than even some of those rural areas. Next slide, please. The land use and built environment module, we wanted to site charging infrastructure in population centers and where multifamily housing exists to reach really as many potential end users as possible. Multifamily residents often face different barriers to EV adoption compared to a single family dwelling. This is mostly due to those types of residents having to rely on a landlord or building owner to install a charging infrastructure at their facility rather than having the capability of installing it on their own. So you'll see in the map, some of the higher priority areas are those city centers throughout the state, but there's also rural areas that are getting a high priority level as well. Go to the next slide. And finally, the team set a high priority for siting charging infrastructure in underserved areas by bringing in these equity layers. We wanted to focus on underserved communities as they often lack charging infrastructure for EVs, but face disproportionate impacts of pollution and poor air quality. Darker green areas reflect sites that are more disadvantaged, and thus they rank higher for siting charging stations through this program. Next slide. So those were the 4 different modules that we looked at. Again, we intend to combine the result of each of these modules into a total result, which will illustrate which areas should be prioritized. And this is at a zip code level. We're still at the stage where we want to understand where is charging needed, and then we can dive into what specific sites and constraints there are. So we're looking to feedback. We're looking for feedback from yourselves on the process and on some of our preliminary findings in terms of those layers that we looked at. Stephanie, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Brendan. So all this information that we gave you, hopefully it was helpful and gave you some insight as to where we are currently with the plan, with our infrastructure, and then where we hope to go. Our next steps are to review any feedback that we receive as a result of today's workshops and previous workshops, and any comments that are provided during that time or in between, or from moving forward from today. We're going to continue to do the analysis and mapping for the plan. Again, taking in consideration any feedback provided. And then we'll be sharing any information and progress that we've made at the next virtual meeting that will more than likely happen after the new year. Next slide. All right, so how do you stay involved? So we talked about next steps. A lot of this information can be available, or will be and is available on the EV Plan website, which can be found at deldot.gov/programs/NEVI. There, within that webpage, you can also access the EV Plan's virtual room, which is pretty cool if you've not seen it or been in a virtual room like that. But you can walk through the room. You can see the webinars that have been provided. You can see the plan itself. So I'd encourage you to check that out. You can also fill out a comment form on the webpage or in the virtual room, and include your email address to that. And you can also email us at evplan@delaware.gov. Again, be looking for information on our next virtual public workshop that, again, should happen after the new year. Next slide. All right, so we're going to move on to our question and answer period for this workshop. You can use the Zoom function, the Q&A function, to submit any questions you have, and we will do our best to answer those questions.
Stephanie, we've got a couple questions that come in.
Okay.
The first one, Brendan, you should be able to answer. I understand there are different weights assessed to parameters within the modules. However, are the modules weighted equally across the modules? For instance, equity versus early adopters, or is there an higher emphasis assigned to any one module?
Yep, so the team assigned high module weighting for equity and the existing EV infrastructure. So one, predominantly fill in the gaps in the existing charging infrastructure, since it was one of the main goals of this program. And then two, equity is a large focus of the project team. So really adding in infrastructure that has been historically left out of those sites. So those two modules received high priority. The early EV adopters and the land use module both received medium weights.
And then in the modeling that we're doing, is there in the forecast, are we modeling more affordable EV chargers? Or are we looking at the cost reduction EVs as time goes on?
Yep, so our EV adoption forecasts do include changes in cost. And so I believe based on our current projections without any significant policy implementations, that cost parity would occur around 2026, 2027. And we utilize a lot of industry papers and historical cost projections to develop that assessment.
And I'd like to follow up on that as well, just throughout the development of this plan and in thinking about doing this plan, access to charging has been top of mind, because we know that in communities that don't have access to garages or off-street parking, that even if you can afford an EV or a used EV and you want to have one, if you don't have home charging or convenient charging local to you, that will be a barrier to having an EV. And so this plan is going to help identify some of those areas so that we can work on those discrete geographic areas to eliminate access to EV charging as a barrier to EV ownership.
Thanks, Susan. Brendan. Another question, Brendan, how are we defining air quality in the modules?
Yep, so really the two data items that we include for that air quality is pollution exposure and asthma rates, and that's from the CDC index that provides data nationally. Obviously, the data has been catered specifically for Delaware and at the census block level.
And then how are the Tesla chargers being taken into account?
So we do include those as existing charging infrastructure in our model. I know that there is some different requirements for federal funding, as they're only accessible by Tesla users. So we do have them included, but really want to complement and look at also where those are gaps in the system, since they're not completely accessible to all users.
And then there's another question, charge point. Is that going to be a part of the plan? How will that be incorporated in the plan?
So right now, there are a number of different, for DC fast charging companies who provide DC fast charging as a business. ChargePoint is one of them, and they also manufacture level 2 chargers. So if you're an electric vehicle driver, you might have a ChargePoint like card, and you might pay ChargePoint for either DC fast charging or even level 2 charging. But ChargePoint is a big company, but they are not the only company. There are other companies, and I'm listing with no preference or prioritization: EVgo, Electrify America, Blink, not the rock band, but the EV charging company, and others. So we're agnostic to brand of charger here. What we're looking at is locations. Bree came off mute, so she's going to save me from myself right now.
Brand a lot of times is just simply that, a gas station is going to serve other vehicles, if it's Shell, Exxon, Wawa, or whoever. It's going to be somewhat analogous to this, where most of the stations, particularly with fast charging, what they call open protocol. So just because you might use a particular station at one location because you have an account with them or what have you, that doesn't mean that you won't be able to, that these networks are intended to and are supposed to be standardized and be able to be open to kind of cross over the networks.
And Bree, would that also apply to the different apps we're looking to cross those boundaries?
Yeah. I mean, most of the apps are crowdsourced, so it really is just an EV driver finding a charging station or a port somewhere and putting that on there. The U.S. Department of Energy's Alternative Fuel Data Center has a station locator that it is somewhat crowdsourced, where station owners can put their information, but there is someone on the other end really looking at that station to make sure it actually is true and it is what it is and available to either the public, or if it's a fleet, or if it's privately owned or what have you. And those stations are followed up on with the owners, at least I think on a pretty annual basis, just to make sure that they have the most up-to-date data. But charge point, plug share, things like that, most of that is all kind of a crowdsourced app.
There are a couple more questions just about the apps, but I think we've covered that. Buyers using credit cards. I think we're moving towards app neutral type payment schemes and or credit card payment schemes for DC fast charging, at least. I know a barrier for putting credit card swipers has been for a long time that just the cost, particularly for level 2 charging, it increased the price of a level 2 charger sort of astronomically. And so manufacturers weren't including them because it made their chargers sort of cost prohibitive. But I think we're moving towards new payment methods and different ways of doing it. There's also a question about coordinating with the EV charging companies that are expanding their charging networks. And, that's part of the reason we're doing this plan. We do have the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Plan and the funding that's coming from the federal government. And we've outlined in that plan the basic geographic locations that we're looking to deploy stations that we will help fund. But if you don't want grant funding, you can put them wherever you want, right? So we're using that to prioritize grant funding. But if there's a private business out there who sees a market that is not consistent with, where we're putting our funding right now, go for it, and they will. I fully expect that is going to continue to happen as we move forward. But I think that the charging companies do, we work with them to some degree because Bree manages a rebate program for level 2 charging stations. We have a pretty good relationship with their government relation people or their Mid-Atlantic people for many of the charging station companies. And so they're paying attention to what we're doing. They're using the data and information that we're putting out, particularly when it is compatible with some funding opportunities for them to help build this infrastructure. I hope that was helpful. Bree, can you help me do better than that?
Yeah, I mean, just it's kind of going to go into segue to the kind of the next question. And the companies kind of talk to each other. They realize like they can't silo themselves. It's not going to help anybody. So they need to make sure that they're kind of, we all talk together, and working together to build out a better network. So, I do see the most recent question about broken chargers and if we are requiring a way for these chargers. So for level 2, we don't, most of the stations that are being installed are going to have warranties, and they're buying stations that have service agreements and networking and fees. And so, but they are privately owned. And so that is between the private station owner and the vendor for, of the brand of the station. When it comes to fast charging, the ones that we fund, either through past infrastructure, the Volkswagen Settlement Fund funded stations that are up and coming, and then the NEVI funded stations, those will all have requirements of at least 5 years for those station owners to operate and maintain the stations to be at a specific uptime, and to address any concerns, be available for customers and AV drivers to access customer service when they need, pretty much 24/7, 365. So, but there will come a point though that those stations, that 5 year, 10 year, whatever, will come up, and it will then be on the liability or the responsibility of that station owner. Again, just as it is as a gas station, if a gas pump is down, it's on the station owner to maintain that station and to upgrade it and to keep it up to technology standards.
I see a question here about the public policy. From a public policy standpoint, how will you backfill the loss to fuel tax revenues from increasing utilization of EVs? And so at DelDOT, we have had conversations about the impact that this transition will have. We have had done a pilot program related to vehicle miles traveled. We have not yet settled on a final solution to that, but that is definitely a discussion item that we are working on. And then the other question is around, my niece bought a small SUV since her apartment building doesn't have chargers. For non-homeowners, this seems like a huge barrier, especially if employers don't have chargers or if remote continues. And I know that we've talked a lot about the fact that for apartment buildings and other, especially in the more urban settings, it's more difficult to provide your own charger at home. And so, we believe that a combination of some policy changes, some policy updates, as well as the improved infrastructure will assist in that. But I will ask for any other input from our DNREC folks.
Absolutely. So with our rebate program that we've got, we actually have a little bit more of a higher percentage of a rebate and the allowance of a few more chargers than it would be at a commercial building for multi-unit dwelling, because we do know that this is a barrier. And there's a lot of different barriers with apartment complexes and condo unit areas, these what they call multi-family, multi-unit dwelling areas. To install that, there's a couple of challenges that people face, and then so I think that sometimes the cost of the infrastructure can be a little bit